The most powerful man in Europe is dying in a rat-infested house on a volcanic rock in the middle of the Atlantic. Napoleon Bonaparte, the emperor who conquered nations, can barely lift his head from his pillow. His stomach is eating itself from the inside out. The pain is unbearable, but that's not what's destroying him. In the darkness of his prison bedroom, thousands of faces stare back at him. Young soldiers frozen in Russian snow, Spanish villagers executed in town squares. The wife he divorced, the son he'll never see again. Every choice, every campaign, every sacrifice, all leading to this moment. And as death finally comes to collect Napoleon, he whispers three final words that change everything we thought we knew about him. The damp walls of Longwood House seemed to close in tighter with each passing day, as if the very structure conspired with the Atlantic winds to suffocate whatever remained of Napoleon Bonaparte's imperial soul. It was April 1821, and the former Emperor of France lay propped against yellowed pillows in a narrow bed that mocked the grandeur of Tuileries Palace. The room reeked of camphor and illness, a sharp contrast to the perfumes that once filled his chambers in Paris. Napoleon's hand trembled as he reached for the glass of water on the bedside table. At 51, he looked 70. His once commanding frame had withered to barely 150 pounds, his grey skin stretched taut over prominent cheekbones. The stomach pain that had plagued him for months now clawed at his insides with relentless fury, each wave forcing him to curl inward, gasping for breath that wouldn't come easily. Through the window, he could see the barren, volcanic landscape of St. Helena stretching toward the endless grey ocean. 6 years. 6 years on this God-forsaken rock, 1,500 miles from the nearest continent, with nothing but British guards and painful memories for company. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had conquered most of Europe now couldn't walk beyond the boundaries of a decaying estate without armed escort. "Your Majesty, you must try to eat something." Louis Marchand, his faithful valet, entered carrying a tray with broth and bread. The young man's eyes betrayed his worry, though he tried to maintain the courtly manner Napoleon still demanded. "Majesty," Napoleon repeated, his voice hoarse and bitter. "Is there anything majestic about a dying man in exile, Marchand?" "You are still the emperor to those who serve you, sir." Napoleon managed a weak smile. Marchand had been with him since before Waterloo, one of the few who had volunteered to follow him into this imprisonment. The young man's loyalty was touching, but it also filled Napoleon with an unfamiliar weight, guilt. "The Emperor," he whispered more to himself than Marchand. "Do you know how many men called me that as they died on battlefields across Europe? Vive l'Empereur on their lips as their blood soaked into foreign soil." Marchand set the tray down carefully, unsure how to respond. These dark moods had become more frequent as Napoleon's health deteriorated. The physicians, Dr. Francesco Antomarchi and the British surgeon John Stocco before him, had warned that his condition was grave, though they disagreed on the diagnosis. Antomarchi suspected an ulcer. The British doctors whispered about hepatitis or cancer. Napoleon suspected it was simpler than that. His body, like his empire, was collapsing under the weight of too many campaigns fought and too many bridges burned. "The pain is worse today," Napoleon admitted, pressing his hand against his abdomen. The admission cost him. He had spent a lifetime refusing to show weakness. "Shall I fetch Dr. Antomarchi?" "No, let him rest. There's nothing he can do that he hasn't already tried." Napoleon shifted in the bed, trying to find a position that didn't amplify the stabbing sensation in his gut. "Sit with me instead. Tell me, what do they say about me in the village? What do the British soldiers whisper when they stand guard?" Marchand hesitated. "It doesn't matter what they... Tell me the truth, boy. I've had enough of courtly lies. They say you're getting what you deserve. That every man who died in Russia, in Spain, in Egypt, that their ghosts have come to collect their due." Napoleon closed his eyes. The words cut deeper than any sword had in his youth. Perhaps they're right. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind rattling the loose window panes and the distant crash of waves against the cliffs. Napoleon's mind drifted, as it often did now, to faces he hadn't thought of in years. Not the kings and generals whose names filled history books, but the ordinary men, the young conscript from Lyon who had shared his rations before Austerlitz, the Italian drummer boy who had lost both legs at Marengo, the countless frozen corpses left behind in the Russian snow. "Do you remember Josephine?" Napoleon asked suddenly, opening his eyes. "Of course, Your Majesty. The Empress was she happy, do you think, in the end?" Marchand chose his words carefully. "I believe she loved you until her final breath, sir." "That's not what I asked." Napoleon's voice carried an edge of desperation. "I divorced her because she couldn't give me an heir. I chose dynasty over devotion. I remarried for political advantage, and when she died—" He paused, swallowing hard. "When she died 6 years ago, I was already here, unable to say goodbye, unable to tell her that—" He couldn't finish. The pain in his stomach flared again, but this time it was matched by an ache in his chest that no medicine could touch. Josephine had been dead for 6 years, and he would soon follow. The empire he'd built to secure his legacy had crumbled. The son he'd sacrificed his marriage to produce was now a virtual prisoner of the Austrians, likely never to rule anything. What had it all been for? 3 days passed before Napoleon felt strong enough to leave his bed for more than a few minutes. With Marchand's support, he shuffled to the small drawing room where he spent most of his waking hours. The British governor, Hudson Lowe, had deliberately chosen Longwood House for its inadequacy. Damp, poorly maintained, infested with rats. It was a far cry from imprisonment. It was calculated humiliation. Count Henri Gratien Bertrand, Napoleon's Grand Marshal and another faithful companion in exile, was waiting with papers requiring attention. Even in decline, Napoleon tried to maintain some semblance of his former routine: correspondence, dictation of memoirs, review of accounts, but today the papers remained untouched on the table. "Henri," Napoleon said, settling into his chair with a grimace, "do you ever regret following me here?" Bertrand looked up from his writing, startled by the question. "Your Majesty, I'm serious. You had a choice. After Waterloo, you could have made peace with the Bourbons, kept your estates, raised your children in France. Instead, you chose this." Napoleon gestured at the peeling wallpaper and mold-stained ceiling. 6 years of exile with a dying tyrant. "You are not a tyrant," Bertrand said firmly. "History will remember you as one of the greatest military minds who ever lived." "Greatest?" Napoleon's laugh was bitter. "I lost, Henri. Waterloo, Leipzig, the Russian disaster, I lost. And hundreds of thousands died because I refused to accept that my time had passed." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Do you know what I dream about? Not my victories, not my coronation or my glory days. I dream about the hospital at Eylau." Bertrand remained silent, recognizing that his emperor needed to speak more than he needed to hear platitudes. "It was 1807, February. We'd won a victory against the Russians, but the cost—" Napoleon's eyes grew distant. 25,000 casualties in a single day. I walked through the field hospital afterward. Rows of men, boys really, screaming as surgeons sawed off frozen limbs, the smell of gangrene and blood. I remember one soldier, couldn't have been more than 16, calling for his mother as he died. He looked right at me, and do you know what he said? "Your Majesty doesn't need to—" He said, "Was it worth it, sir? Please tell me it was worth it." And I told him yes. I told him his sacrifice had secured France's future, that his name would be remembered forever. Napoleon's voice cracked. "I don't even remember his name, Henri. I don't remember any of their names." The clock on the mantel ticked loudly in the heavy silence. Bertrand struggled to find words that wouldn't sound hollow. He had been with Napoleon through years of campaigns, had witnessed both the brilliance and the terrible cost of his ambition. "You gave them glory," Bertrand finally offered. You gave France. I gave France nothing. It wouldn't have had anyway. Napoleon interrupted, the bitterness returning. The revolution had already broken the old order. The ideals of liberty and equality were already unleashed. I simply wrapped myself in their flag and claimed I was their champion while I built an empire that looked suspiciously like the monarchy we'd overthrown. A knock at the door interrupted them. Dr. Antomarchi entered, carrying his medical bag and wearing the perpetually worried expression that had become his default since arriving on St. Helena. Forgive the intrusion, Your Majesty, but I must insist on examining you. The vomiting episodes you described to Marchand concern me greatly. Napoleon waved him in dismissively. What does it matter, Doctor? We both know where this is heading. With proper care and rest, proper care. Napoleon's anger flared suddenly. On this island, in this house, with Governor Lowe denying every request for basic medicines? Don't insult me with false hope, Antomarchi. Just tell me honestly, how long? The Italian physician hesitated, exchanging glances with Bertrand. That's impossible to say with certainty, Your Majesty. The symptoms suggest a serious gastric condition, possibly an ulcer or tumor, but without proper diagnostic tools. Weeks, months, perhaps several weeks. Maybe a few months if we can manage the pain and... Several weeks, Napoleon repeated, sinking back into his chair. The pain in his abdomen chose that moment to lance through him again, sharp and insistent. He doubled over, gasping. Dr. Antomarchi rushed forward, but Napoleon waved him back. Just give me something for the pain, and leave me. Your Majesty, I really should. Leave me. When they were alone again, Napoleon sat in the dim room, listening to the rain begin to patter against the windows. The Atlantic storms were frequent this time of year, turning Longwood into an even more miserable prison. He thought of all the palaces he had occupied. Milan, Berlin, Vienna, Moscow before the fires. He had slept in the beds of kings and emperors, had eaten from plates of gold, had commanded armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and now he would die in a rat-infested house on a volcanic rock, attended by a handful of loyal servants and watched by British guards who celebrated each day he grew weaker. What did I do with my extraordinary life? He whispered to the empty room. What mark did I really leave, beyond graves? Outside, the rain intensified, and somewhere in the house he could hear Marchand speaking softly to one of the other servants. They were probably discussing him, wondering how much longer their exile would last, counting the days until they could return to France and try to reclaim whatever remained of their former lives. Napoleon closed his eyes and allowed himself to remember Paris, not the Paris of imperial parades and coronations, but the Paris of his youth. A skinny Corsican boy, with dreams too big for his station, reading military history by candlelight, convinced he was destined for greatness. That boy had been hungry and ambitious and utterly certain that the world would bend to his will if he just pushed hard enough. That boy had never imagined dying like this. The nightmares came with increasing frequency now. Napoleon would drift into fitful sleep, only to find himself back in the frozen hell of Russia, watching his Grande Armée dissolve into the snow. He would wake gasping, drenched in sweat despite the cold dampness of his room, his stomach churning with pain and something worse, the memory of decisions that had cost so many lives. It was early May now, and his condition had deteriorated noticeably. He could barely keep down even broth, and the pain had become a constant companion rather than an intermittent visitor. Dr. Antomarchi had begun administering increasing doses of laudanum, which brought temporary relief but left Napoleon's mind clouded and his dreams even more vivid. "Tell me about the Russian campaign," he said one afternoon to General Charles Tristan de Montholon, another of his companions in exile. Montholon had joined them later and hadn't been part of the 1812 disaster, But Napoleon needed to talk about it, needed someone to hear his confession. Your Majesty, you've documented that campaign extensively in your memoirs. I've documented the strategy, the battles, the political necessities. I've explained why it made sense to invade, why we couldn't accept Alexander's betrayal of the continental system. Napoleon shifted in his chair, trying to ease the stabbing pain in his gut. But I've never talked about the real cost, the human cost. Montholon set aside the papers he'd been organizing. What would you like to say? 600,000 men. That's how many crossed into Russia with me in June 1812. Do you know how many came back? I've read the estimates. Fewer than 40,000. Fewer than 40,000 men returned from that frozen hell, and most of them were broken in body or mind or both. Napoleon's hands trembled as he spoke. I told them we were defending France against Russian aggression. I told them we were securing our eastern border. The truth is, I couldn't accept that Alexander dared defy me. My pride killed 500,000 men. The campaign had strategic merit, Montholon said carefully. Russia was trading with Britain despite the blockade. Don't, Napoleon's voice was sharp, don't try to justify it to make me feel better. I'm dying, Montholon. The time for comfortable lies is past. He paused, pressing his hand against his stomach as another wave of pain rolled through him. I remember the retreat from Moscow. November and December. The temperature dropping to 40 below zero. Men froze standing up, turned into ice sculptures in the middle of the road. Horses dropped dead by the thousands. We ate them, of course, those lucky enough to get to the carcasses before they froze solid. Montholon listened in silence, recognizing that this wasn't really a conversation. It was a purgation, a desperate attempt to voice the guilt Napoleon had carried for 9 years. There was a young cavalry officer, I can't remember his name, who approached me during the retreat. His unit had been ordered to cover our rear, which was essentially a death sentence. He looked me in the eye and asked if France would remember them, if their families would know they died for something that mattered. Napoleon's voice broke. I promised him they would be remembered as heroes. 3 days later, his entire squadron was wiped out by Cossacks. I don't even know if his family ever learned what happened to him. Many families suffered, Montholon acknowledged quietly. And for what? What did their suffering accomplish? Russia wasn't conquered. The continental system collapsed anyway. Within 2 years, we were fighting for France's very survival, and within 3, I was in exile the first time. Napoleon laughed bitterly. All that death and suffering, and it bought me nothing but a few more years of playing emperor. The reign had started again, the perpetual reign of St. Helena that turned the island into a soggy prison. Napoleon could hear it drumming on the roof, trickling through the leaks that the British refused to repair. Every drop seemed to whisper the names of the dead, an endless litany of accusations. I see their faces sometimes, he admitted. When I'm half asleep, in that space between waking and dreaming, thousands upon thousands of faces, all looking at me with the same question in their eyes. Why did you waste our lives? And I have no answer. I have no answer that justifies what I did to them. Dr. Antomarchi appeared in the doorway, accompanied by Louis Marchand, carrying fresh linens and medicine. Napoleon's symptoms had worsened throughout the day. Vomiting, cold sweats, episodes of delirium. The physician insisted on examining him, noting with concern the distension of his abdomen and the yellowing of his skin. Your Majesty, I believe we should increase the dosage of— Just do whatever you think will help, Napoleon interrupted wearily. I have no energy left to debate medical theories. As Antomarchi prepared his instruments and medicines, Napoleon's mind drifted again, this time to Spain. The Peninsular War, another catastrophic decision driven by arrogance and ambition. He had thought subjugating Spain would be simple, that the Spanish people would accept his brother Joseph as their king once they saw the benefits of French rule. Instead, He had unleashed a 6-year guerrilla war that drained France of men and resources. The Spanish called it the War of Independence. His soldiers called it the Spanish Ulcer, a fitting name for a wound that never healed, that kept bleeding France dry no matter how many troops he poured into the Iberian Peninsula. "I turned Spain into a graveyard," he whispered, not sure if anyone could hear him over Antomarchi's preparations. Not just French soldiers, but Spanish civilians. Whole villages burned, thousands executed. And for what? Because I thought I knew better than everyone else, because I couldn't tolerate defiance. The medicine Antomarchi administered brought a welcome numbness, dulling both physical and emotional pain. As Napoleon's consciousness began to blur, he had one final lucid thought. Perhaps this suffering was justice. Perhaps dying slowly, in pain, with nothing but regrets for company, was exactly what he deserved for all the suffering he had inflicted on others. "Tell me," he murmured as sleep claimed him, "does God forgive the sins of conquerors?" No one answered. Perhaps there was no answer to give. Napoleon's condition continued its relentless decline. By mid-May, he could barely leave his bed, and the pain had become so intense that he spent most hours in a laudanum-induced haze. But in his more lucid moments, his thoughts turned increasingly to his son, the King of Rome, the heir to an empire that no longer existed. "Marchand," he called weakly one morning, "bring me the miniature portrait, the one of my son." Louis Marchand retrieved the small painting from the drawer where Napoleon kept his few treasured possessions. It showed a cherubic boy of perhaps 4 years old, with fair hair and his mother Marie-Louise's Habsburg features. Napoleon Francois Charles Joseph Bonaparte, now living in Vienna as a virtual prisoner of his maternal grandfather, the Austrian emperor. Napoleon held the miniature with trembling hands, studying the face of the boy he barely knew. His son was nearly 10 years old now. How much had he changed? Did he remember his father at all? The boy had been only 3 when Napoleon abdicated and went into his first exile on Elba. "I thought I was securing his future," Napoleon said softly. Bertrand had entered the room and now stood quietly nearby, giving his emperor space to speak. "That's what I told myself when I divorced Josephine and married the Austrian princess, that I needed a legitimate heir, a son who would carry on my name and rule the empire I had built." "Every emperor needs an heir," Bertrand offered. "Yes, but at what cost?" Napoleon's voice carried a weight of profound sadness. "I destroyed Josephine to get this boy, and now he'll never rule anything. Marie-Louise remarried years ago. Did you know that? She's the Duchess of Parma now, married to some Austrian count, and she's prevented my son from having any contact with anyone who might tell him the truth about his father. The boy knows who you are, surely. He knows I was Napoleon Bonaparte, the Corsican usurper who terrorized Europe and was defeated. That's what the Austrians teach him. They've erased his French identity, probably forbid him from speaking French at all. He goes by Franz now, not Francois. They've turned my heir into an Austrian puppet." Napoleon's grip on the miniature tightened. "I gave up everything. My marriage, my happiness, Josephine's happiness, for a son I'll never see again, who will never inherit anything I built." The bitter irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent years obsessing over legacy, over creating a dynasty that would rival the Habsburgs and Bourbons. He had married into the oldest royal house in Europe, convinced that blood ties would legitimize his empire. Instead, he had simply given his enemies the perfect hostage and his wife an excuse to abandon him. "Do you think he's happy?" Napoleon asked. "Living in Vienna, being raised as an Austrian prince?" Bertrand considered the question carefully. "He's probably comfortable, well cared for. The Austrians wouldn't mistreat him. But is he happy? Does he laugh? Does he have friends? Does he dream about his future?" Napoleon set the miniature down on the bedside table, no longer able to look at it. Or is he lonely and confused, wondering why his father never came back for him? "You couldn't have," Bertrand began, but Napoleon cut him off with a weak wave of his hand. "I couldn't have done many things differently, I know. That's what everyone says. But the truth is, I could have. After Leipzig, after the coalition armies crossed into France, I could have accepted peace terms that would have left me as emperor, but with reduced territory. My advisors begged me to negotiate. Marie-Louise begged me, but I refused because I couldn't accept that I had been beaten, that the empire I built was crumbling. My pride kept the war going for months longer, and when I finally abdicated, I'd lost everything." The pain in his stomach surged again, and Napoleon curled onto his side, gasping. Dr. Antomarchi, who had been dozing in a chair in the corner, immediately woke and rushed to his bedside with medicine. But before accepting it, Napoleon grabbed the doctor's wrist. "Promise me something," he said urgently. "Promise me that when I die, you'll send word to my son. Tell him his father's last thoughts were of him. Tell him, I'm sorry I chose ambition over being his father. Tell him I hope he finds more happiness than I ever did. Your Majesty, you mustn't speak of death. Promise me." The effort of raising his voice sent a spasm of pain through Napoleon's entire body, and he collapsed back against the pillows, breathing heavily. "I promise," Antomarchi said softly, administering the laudanum. "I'll make sure he knows." As the medicine took effect, Napoleon's mind wandered to memories of the brief time he'd had with his son, teaching the toddler to march, watching him play soldier with tiny wooden weapons, seeing the boy's face light up when Napoleon returned from campaign. Those moments had been rare. He'd been too busy with war and statecraft to be a father, but they were precious now. He thought, too, of Josephine's children from her first marriage, Eugène and Hortense. He had been more of a father to them than to his own blood son, had actually spent time with them, guided their education, arranged their marriages. Eugène had served him loyally as Viceroy of Italy and general, never faltering even when Napoleon's fortunes turned. Hortense, despite an unhappy marriage to his brother Louis, had remained devoted. They had been family, real family, not political tools or dynasty-building projects, but people he had genuinely cared for. And he had thrown it all away, had divorced their mother and marginalized them in favor of an Austrian marriage alliance that brought him nothing but a son he barely knew and a wife who abandoned him at the first opportunity. "I made every wrong choice," he whispered to the darkness as sleep claimed him, "every single one." In his dreams that night, he saw his son as a young man, dressed in Austrian military uniform, standing before a portrait of Napoleon. But the boy's face was blank, emotionless. He was looking at a painting of a stranger, a figure from history with no personal connection. And when Dream Napoleon tried to call out to him, to explain, to apologize, no sound came from his mouth. He was already a ghost, and his son didn't even notice he was there. The last week of Napoleon Bonaparte's life began on May 1st, 1821. By then, he was confined entirely to bed, his body ravaged by what modern historians would later diagnose as stomach cancer. The pain had become so severe that he spent most hours in a morphine-induced stupor, occasionally surfacing into brief moments of clarity. On May 3rd, during one such lucid interval, he asked Montholon and Bertrand to witness his will. With great difficulty, he dictated provisions for his faithful servants, detailed instructions for his memoirs, and messages for his family. But the most significant moment came when he addressed his legacy. "I want it recorded," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that of all my victories, the one I'm most proud of is the Napoleonic Code. Not Austerlitz, not the campaigns, not the conquest of Europe. The Code, the legal reforms that gave France and much of Europe modern civil law. That's what I hope survives me." Bertrand wrote carefully, noting the irony. The legal framework that established equality before the law, meritocracy and religious tolerance, These civilian achievements were what Napoleon chose to emphasize at the end, not the military glory that had defined his public image. "And I want to state clearly," Napoleon continued, struggling to breathe, "that my son is my rightful heir, though I know he'll never claim what should be his. Tell him I hope he has a better life than I did. A simpler life, a life not consumed by ambition." Over the next several days, Napoleon's condition deteriorated rapidly. He experienced violent vomiting, delirium, and periods where he couldn't recognize those around him. During one fevered episode, he called out orders to troops long dead, refighting battles that existed only in memory. Other times he wept and called for Josephine, seeming to forget she had died years earlier. Dr. Antomarchi maintained a careful log of symptoms, knowing that this deathbed vigil would become part of history. The physician observed the progressive weakness, the distension of Napoleon's abdomen, the shallow breathing, and the gradual shutdown of his body's systems. There was nothing medical science of 1821 could do except manage pain and provide comfort. On May 4th, during a moment of clarity, Napoleon asked Marchand to open the window so he could see the ocean one last time. The loyal valet complied, and Napoleon gazed out at the grey Atlantic waters that had been his prison for 6 years. "Do you know what I regret most?" he asked Marchand, who was holding his hand. "Not the defeats, not even the exile. I regret every young man who died believing his sacrifice was noble and necessary. I regret every mother who lost a son, every wife who lost a husband, every child who grew up without a father, all because I couldn't be content with enough. You gave France glory, Your Majesty. No, Louis. I gave France casualties. I gave France wars they didn't need and defeats they didn't deserve. And I told myself it was all for them, for the revolution, for liberty and equality. But it was for me. It was always for me. For my pride, my ambition, my need to prove that a Corsican nobody could dominate Europe." Napoleon's grip on Marchand's hand tightened with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll remember the truth. When they write the histories and paint me as a hero or a villain, remember that I was just a man who let his dreams become more important than other people's lives." Marchand couldn't speak, tears streaming down his face. He simply nodded. By May 5th, Napoleon was barely conscious. The few servants and companions who had followed him into exile gathered in the small bedroom, keeping vigil as their emperor slipped away. Outside, a storm raged, fitting weather for the death of a man who had unleashed so many tempests across Europe. In his final hours, Napoleon's breathing became labored and irregular. Antomarchi checked his pulse repeatedly, noting its weakness. The end was near. At one point, Napoleon's eyes opened, and he seemed to see something beyond the room, beyond the island, beyond the present moment. "France," he whispered. "Armée, Josephine." Those were his last coherent words. France, the country he had both elevated and devastated, the army, the instrument of his glory and the source of his greatest guilt, and Josephine, the woman he had loved and sacrificed for ambition's sake. At 5:49 p.m. on May 5, 1821, Napoleon Bonaparte's breathing stopped. Dr. Antomarchi checked for a pulse and found none. The former Emperor of France, King of Italy, protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, and conqueror of much of Europe, was dead at 51 years old. The room fell silent except for the sound of wind and rain against the windows. Marchand broke down, sobbing. Bertrand stood rigid, his military bearing barely containing his grief. Montholon made the sign of the cross. Dr. Antomarchi carefully recorded the time of death in his journal, his hand steady despite the historical significance of the moment. 2 days later, on May 7th, Dr. Antomarchi performed an autopsy. He found severe stomach cancer, with the tumor having perforated the stomach wall. The cause of death was officially recorded as gastric carcinoma, though debates would rage for decades about whether the British had poisoned him. But the physical cause of death was almost irrelevant compared to the spiritual death that had occurred in those final weeks. The death of the myth Napoleon had built around himself, replaced by the painful truth of a man forced to confront the cost of his choices. On May 9th, Napoleon was buried in the Valley of the Geraniums on St. Helena, as per his request. He wanted to be buried on the island where he had died, among the willows by the spring where he had sometimes walked in better days. The British governor, Hudson Lowe, wouldn't allow his tombstone to read Napoleon Bonaparte. They fought over the inscription, with Lowe insisting on Napoleon Bonaparte to emphasize his Corsican origins. In the end, the grave was marked with no name at all, just a blank stone that somehow seemed appropriate for a man who had died questioning the very legacy he had spent his life building. But in the pockets of his waistcoat, Marchand found two items Napoleon had kept close to his heart in his final days: a lock of Josephine's hair and the miniature portrait of his son. These, more than all the swords and crowns and imperial regalia, revealed what had mattered to him at the end. Not glory or conquest, but love and family, the very things he had sacrificed for ambition. 19 years later, in 1840, King Louis-Philippe of France negotiated for Napoleon's remains to be returned to Paris. The body was exhumed and transported back to France with great ceremony, eventually interred in Les Invalides under a magnificent red porphyry sarcophagus. France had forgiven her wayward son, transforming him again into a legend. But those who had been present at Longwood House, who had heard his anguished confessions and witnessed his painful reckoning with mortality, knew a different truth. They knew that Napoleon Bonaparte, the real man behind the legend, had died not as a defiant emperor or unrepentant conqueror, but as a human being who had finally understood the true cost of his ambitions and found it far too high. The question he had asked in his delirium remained unanswered, echoing through history. Was it worth it? The glory, the empire, the name that would never be forgotten. Was any of it worth the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, the families destroyed, the suffering inflicted? Napoleon himself had provided the answer in his final lucid moments. No, 1,000 times no. That was his last gift to history. Not another justification or rationalization, but a simple, painful truth. Ambition without humanity leads only to regret. And glory bought with others' suffering is no glory at all.